Today, we're going to debunk 5 common myths about walking bass lines. Let's get to it. Welcome to Learn Jazz Bass with Matt Ribicki. I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for joining me today. These 5 myths that we are talking about, I first encountered in a sort of thread, or I can't remember if it was in a thread or a post on Talk Bass, or if I'd seen it somewhere else, but it's from the wonderful bassist Pete Coco. And he has some examples in this sort of, I don't know, little 3-page sort of dissertation, you want to say, that he wrote that I thought were really good, and his points were excellent, and it stuck with me for many, many years. So I thought, why not share it with those of you who may not have already seen this on Talk Bass or sort of going around the internet. I've seen it in various forms, although not always attributed to Pete. So nonetheless, let's talk about these 5 things a little bit more in depth and with a couple of examples. So the first myth that I want to talk about today with you has to do with the myth that the more harmonically complicated a bass line is, the better it is. So to say that again, a line is best when it is harmonically complicated. That's a myth. We don't have to have this sort of complication in what we're doing. In fact, if we are trying to sort of play the extensions, or what we might call tensions of a chord, we can sort of get in the way of what the other players are doing. Generally, a chordal instrument, a piano, guitar, are going to be playing those extensions, the tensions, and we don't need to play them. Also, if we are accompanying a soloist, we can get in the way of what they're doing. And it's not really our job to be constantly sort of going for the sort of more obscure sound of the chord. Our job is to reinforce the fundamental harmony of what's happening. So here are a couple of examples. One from Scott LaFaro, who we may think of as a pretty complicated player, but here's a little snippet of his line on Autumn Leaves. And check out what he's doing by basically just sticking to chord tones. There's nothing unusual. He's not putting any substitutions. There's nothing strange or outside the norm of what we would expect from a good solid bass line. So let's take a listen now to his little excerpt from Autumn Leaves. So you may notice at the end there, it did get a little bit less than expected. We weren't playing roots on the downbeats. For example, the second to last bar, we have the C natural on D7, which is the flat 7 on the downbeat as opposed to the root. But that said, I think this is a pretty sort of inside baseball. I don't know if that's a phrase. Is that a phrase? It's a sort of inside expectations is what I'm trying to say. And of course, he ends, of course, on the minor third of G minor 7, so that B flat. Nonetheless, he's not doing anything crazy. He's not alluding to some other kind of harmony. He's just sticking to exactly what the chords are. And, this idea comes from lots of great bass players before Scott LaFaro and before us. One being Walter Page, who is famous for playing with Count Basie. And some people say he is sort of the first to sort of codify the idea of playing 4 quarter notes to a bar. So we're talking about kind of early music, quote unquote. And you'll notice when we play this little excerpt from Lady Be Good, this is very harmonically basic, but we're talking about somebody who made a fantastic sound at a fantastic time in the creation of the music and was basically defining what the role of the bass is supposed to be. So let's listen to this excerpt from Walter Page from Lady Be Good. So again, we're talking about the foundations of the walking bass line. So it kind of makes sense that it wouldn't be very harmonically complicated, but this is great stuff. We want to hear this. Other players want to hear this kind of thing. So why not go back to the original idea and don't be afraid of using that foundational information when you're improvising your line. It doesn't have to be harmonically complicated. So the second myth is that we never want to repeat the same note twice in a row. That's a myth, to not repeat a note. And this is particularly common when we have sort of the educational setting where people are trying to teach people how to play walking bass. It's sort of passed down through the recent years that this is a really important thing, but the fact is that's not actually part at all of the history of playing this music. Yes, it can get repetitive and boring if you do it too often, but it can also be really powerful and really useful as a tool. We talked in earlier videos about Ray Brown's use of repeating notes to build tension, what I call and he called spinning the wheels. So you build tension and then release it. That does fall under this heading, but I think more broadly, we shouldn't be afraid to repeat notes consecutively. In fact, it sometimes makes a lot of sense to really reinforce the harmony and the form and so on and so forth. It is a completely safe tool to use. So let's look at a couple examples of this. The first is from Butch Warren and a version of Evidence with Thelonious Monk. And you notice there is pretty much all repeated notes here. So let's take a listen to Butch Warren on Evidence. So there's certainly nothing fancy there, is there? But think about the fact that this is a master bass player playing with master musicians, and he is essentially just repeating notes at least twice in a row. And in the last two bars, he's playing just B flats for 4 beats in each bar. So I think that's very clear proof positive that repeating notes is not something that we need to shy away from. Let's look at another example, this time from Ray Brown, but not something that I've talked about before so far in these videos. This is the beginning of a solo on the song Work Song, which is essentially in F minor usually. So this is a long string of F minor. So let's take a listen to that. And this little repeated descending thing we talked about in the minor blues video that I did a little bit. And it's always a safe bet on a blues to have this repeated thing. In fact, it's almost sort of expected in certain circumstances. You don't have to use it, but it's certainly a very accessible, always good sounding little tool to have this descending line where you repeat each note. This is kind of like a minor blues. Work Song is. It's not formally a minor blues. Nonetheless, it gets a great feeling, especially when the band is swinging, to do things this way. And the third myth has to do with what we just talked about, repeating things. And we just talked about repeating notes. And it is a myth that we shouldn't repeat a whole phrase. And in fact, just like with the notes, it can be used to great effect to reinforce the sound of what the bass player is trying to do. I'm not saying take the lazy or easy way out and figure out what you're going to play over one chorus of a tune and just play that over and over again. That's not the goal of what we're trying to do with a walking line. That's not really improvisation at all, is it? But to be able to intelligently repeat an idea when necessary or with the intention of, as I say, reinforcing what you're trying to do, it can be very, very effective. Our first example is Oscar Pettiford's beginning walking line on the first solo of his famous recording of his tune, Tricketism. Not the melody itself, which we'll do in another video, but his actual walking line, the beginning of it. The first 2 A's, he essentially repeats the 8 bars of the first A exactly the same for the second 8 bars. This is Oscar Pettiford. To me, probably the most intelligent soloist and bass player possibly in the history of the music. One of the most sophisticated for sure. And here he is repeating 8 measures. So let's take a listen to Oscar Pettiford walking on Tricketism. think the second half of those A sections with those ascending 2 chords per bar, I find it very, very helpful in that kind of instance, especially when it's ascending chromatically like that, G flat to G to A flat, that this use of repeating notes that we talked about in myth number 2 is very, very effective. And I can't say as to why Oscar Pettiford did this in this particular place, in this particular way, but when you hear the recording, it sounds amazing. So nothing wrong with doing that. And as I talked about in a recent video with a transcription of Paul Chambers on giant steps, he uses the same ideas plural, many times throughout the few minutes of giant steps. Remember, it's a very fast tempo, it's difficult changes, difficult, unfamiliar changes really. But he figures out something at the beginning, he uses a few of those little bits and pieces here and there. He figures something else out for the following choruses. He uses that again, here and there. He figures something else out the next chorus. So he's evolving as the choruses go, but within each one, he is either playing directly phrases that he played earlier or alluding to what he did earlier. So here is a section from the fourth chorus, the fourth chorus going into the fifth chorus. And these 8 bars, the first 8 bars of the form, he is playing this exact 8 bars, exactly the same, but it's later in the next chorus. That said, I think it's really, really interesting that again, one of the GOATs, if not the GOAT, the greatest of all time, is reusing material from himself, from the same performance. So what I'm going to do here, since it's in one chorus and then later, is I'm going to play the beginning of the chorus just as he's written, and then I will improvise the second half of the form, and then I will repeat what he does just as he does on the recording, and then I will improvise perhaps the end of that form. So we're doing 2 choruses. The first half of each is what Paul played. The second half is just me filling the space, basically. So I'll try to sort of maybe point it out or raise my eyebrows as we play it. So let's take a listen to this from Giant Steps. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense to you, what I was doing there. But yeah, Paul is using big phrases, sometimes 1 measure, sometimes 2. Here he's using 8, many, many times over the course of these choruses of Giant Steps. And that goes to show 2 amazing, unbelievable master bass players who are repeating phrases over and over again. It is a myth that you shouldn't do that. Now, myth number 4 is that we need more rhythmic variation in our walking lines to make them good. In other words, the more rhythmic variation, the better. And that is not true, as all these things. Yes, having some variation is important to make it sound good, but it is commonly a problem for players who are sort of progressing on the path to overdo this. I know many bass players have talked about it. Putting too many ghost notes, too many skip notes, too many triplet drops, and so on and so forth. Your time, your sense of being part of the collective, your reinforcement of the form and the harmony is all aided by not getting distracted by doing too much extraneous stuff. Remember, our goal, unless you are Scott LaFaro playing with Bill Evans, our goal is that we are a supportive role, a foundational, bass, B-A-S-E, aspect of the harmony. And we don't want to distract from that, is basically the short way of saying that. So here is an example of Oscar Pettiford, again, on a blues, sort of it is a blues, the turnaround is a little different, called Juicy Fruit. And notice the repetition of phrases here as well, like we talked about earlier. But here are 3 choruses of the blues where he only plays 3 eighth notes total Everything else is quarter notes. So let me repeat that. 3 choruses of blues where there's only 3 eighth notes in total. So check out this example of our 4th myth that the more rhythmic variation, the better. That's not true. Pretty great, I think. I mean, you don't miss, I think, that extra rhythmic variation at all because like his line is so strong, it just sounds so right. Again, this is a master doing this. So it's okay to not have a lot of rhythmic variation, to be thoughtful and careful about it. I remember when the drummer Carl Allen told me a story about one of the first times he played with Ron Carter. And he was playing at the Vanguard, which is a pretty neat place to play for the first time with Ron Carter. I'm talking about the Village Vanguard. And he said that, I don't remember what the song was necessarily, maybe if he sees this, he'll remind me what he was talking about. But basically he was saying, I think it was several choruses, if not minutes, went by before Ron dropped any eighth notes whatsoever. In other words, it was quarter notes only for multiple choruses or multiple minutes of a tune. And he said that when Ron dropped that eighth note for the first time, it had such a huge impact. It was like a bomb because you were waiting for it, you know? And he relayed that story to us as students, and I always sort of pictured that in my head and wish I could have been there for that. But yeah, so using those rhythmic accents judiciously can be really, really powerful. And knowing that we don't have to do it all the time leads us to pay attention to the important things, which is making that line sound as good as it can with the feeling and the notes. The last myth I want to talk about is that the myth is that note choice is the most important aspect of the walking bass line. And I just kind of said you want to make it sound good by your note choices and the feeling. But as I've said before in at least 2 videos, the feeling is the priority over the note choice. And having somebody else say this, reading this from somebody else that I respect, means a lot to me and makes me pay attention when I'm hearing bass lines and bass playing that values that. And it's something that I try to do as best I can. It's you know, we're all fallible and imperfect. Unless you're Oscar Pettiford, but nonetheless, to try to get that feel right is more important than trying to get the notes right. How do we work on this? You know, it's always been said, and I've always been an advocate for playing along with recordings, like with the bass that's playing, like play along with a Duke Ellington recording, play along with a Bill Evans recording, whatever. It's okay that the bass is there. What you're trying to do is sort of get inside the music, pretend that you're there and mimic the feeling that's going on. And, you know, Cole Davis, who I assume most of you know, recently had a warm-up video where he was talking about warming up your feel. And I told him, I just thought that was the most brilliant thing, that you can warm up your feel. And he says, I do this by playing along with great recordings. And it doesn't have to be the transcription of what the bass player is playing. Rather, you are playing along with that ensemble and trying to mimic the feeling. And I got to give him a shout out again. It was such a clever thing. I've never heard anybody say that. And I really, it's going to stick with me forever. Like some of these other things have stuck with me. That thing is going to stick with me. So warm up your feel when you can. For our example, for this particular myth, I've taken a chorus it's two choruses from Doug Watkins playing on tune-up with Sonny Rollins. And this is a walking bass solo, which is always fun to hear. There is no chordal instrument, so Doug is very free to do what he wants. And you'll notice if you look analytically at the line, there's a lot of sort of strange stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you hear the original, again, go to the link. I didn't say this earlier. I'm going to put a link below for a playlist for these recordings. Really go to it and listen for it specifically, because you'll hear that his feeling overtakes any of these sort of strange note choices. So let's take a listen to a couple of choruses from Doug Watkins on Tune Up. So listening to it by itself and with me playing it, you might have heard some things that really stuck out as a little bit strange. But I think if you check out the original recording, you'll notice that the feeling really does overcome any of those sort of quote unquote strange notes. So please do go check that out and consider for yourself that you want to make the feeling the priority sort of no matter what. So as you listen to bass lines going forward, please consider these things. And as you create your own lines, please consider these myths that we talked about. And I think that you'll find that it not only frees you up from what you might feel are some sort of rules that you're supposed to follow, but it also helps you to listen more deeply when you are considering what another bass player is doing. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that this was helpful. If you want to learn more about how to play jazz bass, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. I've got a link below for a free PDF. Please check that out. And always remember, straight ahead and strive for tone.